recently heard. And in reading an article that brought it up, I then had to go on a little bit of a rabbit hole to be able to figure out what it was so I could put it in context. And the more that I read, the more that I thought, well, this is something pretty interesting and hopefully something that you guys enjoy hearing about. So what is the behavioral immune system? It's a collection, there's a phrase used by psychologist Mark Shaler in 2011 to describe a set of adaptive psychological mechanisms that serve as a first line of defense against harm, so harm from disease or infection. Its purpose is to detect risk in the environment and facilitate our avoidance of that risk. Clearly something that would be beneficial to the long-term health of a community or a species. However, the perceptual cues very often are not good indicators of risk, and they're often poorly correlated with any real threats, which leads to a couple errors in the system. First type of possible errors is a signal detection problem. The behavioral immune system responds to a wide set of overly inclusive stimuli, more than actually correlate to risk. Shaler calls it a smoke detector problem. So like a smoke detector, it creates false positives. And with a smoke detector, you want false positives because a false negative could potentially lead to a fatal situation. But too many false positives and your behavioral immune system has you avoiding things that are not really necessary to avoid. The second error is in the analysis of a cost-benefit ratio. That cost-benefit ratio is going to be highly individual, but is really easy to misassess based on even something as simple as the perception of increased or decreased vulnerability to what it is that you would want to be avoiding. So you might be avoiding things that are not necessary, or possibly even not avoiding things that you maybe should be based on how you're interpreting the cost-benefit ratio. So why does it matter and why are we talking about it? I've been trying to make the slides kind of visually engaging, and I picked this particular image because it kind of, to me, looks like the dinosaurs are giving each other a side eye. So that's kind of a clue as to why we maybe want to talk about this today. Behavioral immune system has some interpersonal implications. So obviously some pathogens spread interpersonally in a variety of ways. So while outgoing social behavior has many benefits, we all know that we're social creatures, and we've discussed at length before the detrimental effects of loneliness and isolation. But social behavior also carries then a risk when it comes to potential exposure to a pathogen. Too many false alarms or a miscalculation of the cost-benefit ratio could lead to a development of avoidance patterns, which could be particularly bad for people who are already experiencing anxiety and depression, really exacerbating in some of the symptoms of things like social anxiety disorder, heightening anxiety, which we've actually seen a lot in the last 2 years. Interestingly, the behavioral immune system also seems to influence some personality traits. So for example, in individuals and even at a community level, higher levels of germ aversion or higher levels of perceived risk of infection correlate to lower levels of extroversion, lower levels of openness, less creativity, risk-taking, and willingness to deviate from norms. Behavioral immune system also taps into our emotions. A body of literature indicates that the specific emotional experience that's a key to the behavioral immune system is the emotion of disgust. So disgust responses appear to be attuned to basic principles of contagion. It inspires cautionary withdrawal from and avoidance of threats to health. Behavioral immune system responds with disgust not only to sensory cues, but also behaviors that violate norms related to diseases and health, like food preparation and hygiene. It can also respond to things perceived as atypical or unfamiliar. It also responds to what is referred to in the literature as moral disgust. Moral disgust is intended to protect us from things that have a negative impact on long-term health and fitness. So things like substances, certain sexual behaviors or partners, individuals with antisocial personality traits or antisocial behaviors that could threaten a population or group. So research in the context of cultural anthropology suggests that there's an overlap between disgust, anger, and contempt. But in the world of, and the literature around the behavioral immune system, the focus is really on disease aversion. for the behavioral immune system to be triggered, it has to perceive a threat. So, but remember, that threat doesn't have to be real. Well, we learn what's typical and acceptable versus disgusting and unacceptable in social and cultural contexts. And this is where you see things like the politics of disgust and the process of othering impacting the behavioral immune system. Politics can be used to create and lean in on stereotypical characterizations of certain groups to elicit, discuss, and create the process of othering. This is something that we've seen way too much of in history. It can lead to dehumanization of outgroups, which facilitates aggression, discrimination. And you see this even with perpetrators of violence on individual and large levels. And inhumane acts, those perpetrators often liken their victims to infectious diseases or to the things that transmit infectious disease, such as rats or cockroaches. It's important to remember that while the behavioral immune system is simply trying to help us avoid disease, it's responding to cues, which are often stereotypes that are created in this social, cultural, political sphere. And that stereotypes often serve many functions that have nothing to do with disease, but have everything to do with maintaining a certain power differential in the society. So with this in mind, you could see how the psychological salience of a potential infection could contribute towards unsociable, discriminatory behaviors. Individuals with more sensitive behavioral immune systems, when surveyed, are more prone to report disgust of outgroups, particularly outgroups stigmatized by physical appearance, a subjectively foreign nature, or violation of standard norms. Authors of a 2017 study found a greater sensitivity of the behavioral immune system is associated with a greater opposition to immigration, and that this relationship could be weakened through cues of familiarity, both physical or cultural familiarity, or cues of disease protection. Disgust is a major obstacle to perspective taking and learning about other groups and cultures, things that are really important in countering prejudice and discrimination. And some kind of interesting research that's been shown is that women in the first trimester of pregnancy, when immune systems are more naturally suppressed, show heightened levels of ethnocentric and xenophobic attitudes than prior to their pregnancy or when you resurvey in the third trimester. So at a heightened sense of vulnerability, you get a heightened sense of, or a heightened report and see heightened ethnocentric and xenophobic attitudes. So obviously tying to prejudice and discrimination. And we've seen this play out over the last 2 years in a very public way. I mean, think about all of the stories that we've seen about violence towards people of an Asian background, not only Chinese immigrants, but people of many Asian backgrounds, even born in the US. So a study published last year examined whether the threat of contracting COVID-19 strengthened the link between Americans' behavioral immune system sensitivity and disgust towards immigrants and other outgroups. And the outgroups that they were looking at, just to see the comparison, were those that might trigger some type of moral disgust, such as sex offenders, people with substance use disorders, homeless populations, and people that were considered in violation of some type of sexual norm. So also looking at transgender and LGBTQ populations. And what they found specifically with the Chinese population, Chinese immigrants, is that yes, behavioral immune system sensitivity exerted a strong direct effect on feelings of disgust towards Chinese people during a time that they were being associated with disease by the media and political figures in mass. I think how initially this COVID-19 was often called in the media the Wuhan flu. And disgust predicted an increase in blatant dehumanization. And when they looked at all of those same variables with the different outgroups, they saw the same results. So across the models, intergroup disgust predicted dehumanization, and this was a stronger predictor than prejudicial attitudes or conservative slantings. The only exception to this that they found was actually homelessness, where prejudice towards homelessness was the strongest predictor towards dehumanization, whereas disgust of homeless was not a predictor of dehumanization. So some social implications. we all know that we're living in an increasingly divided world, a world that was very divided in many ways prior to the pandemic. And the behavioral immune system might further divide us, especially during times of perceived higher risk, which the last 2 years have been. So I recently read an article, the one that introduced me to this phrase and kind of inspired my rabbit hole, noted that we're seeing the behavioral immune system divide us in even more subtle ways than just the disease itself. Even when you look at the vaccine or masks or the way that we've had to socially distance and whether or not to open the economy or shut things back down, the behavioral immune system is activated on all sides, whether it's you're fearing the virus or you're fearing the economic collapse, or you're fearing vaccines for many very good logical reasons, or maybe you're not even fearing vaccines, but you're asking more questions. Everybody's behavioral immune system is just flaring all over the place. And what it's doing is it's firing lots of false alarms and entrenches us into a state of panic, fear, and disgust of the other, which further divides us and creates more social disruption. So what to do? I have a couple of my own thoughts. I'd really like to hear from all of you. My thoughts are we really need to get away from this desire to put everything into a neat little box and our desire for tribalism and to other, and try to keep within ourselves. We have to approach everything that we can with as much humility and humanity as possible. I would say be careful of what you ingest, because the media do a very good job at slanting us one way or the other and tapping into our behavioral immune systems by giving us all new stimuli to potentially be triggered by and go farther into an entrenched state of panic. Here are the articles that I pulled from, including the original Schaller article that coins the term behavioral immune system.